if the courts function fantastically, would you still ever see a situation where Bush or Blair would have to see an international court for their crimes of aggression in Iraq? You would not.
To close the case for side proposition, I look to the Press and Sponsorship Officer, MPhil in Economics, Bilal Moin.
That'll be fun to follow up on. Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thank you very much, members of this esteemed chamber. Good evening. Let me start off by saying I'm not a lawyer, and thank God for that. I'm not shackled by the euphemisms of side opposition. I have no legal fictions to paint for you. I have no polite pretensions to give you to sustain this task that the international law, or the courts in that matter, actually work. We are told tonight that these courts are fair, they're impartial, and they're indispensable. Allow me to cut through this grandstanding, rebut some of these arguments, and convince you this is a mere fantasy, it's a fallacy, it's a fool's paradise, it's a utopian delusion, a dysfunction, wrapped up in some legalese and some optimism. As my previous speakers have done a fantastic job in telling you, these courts do nothing but perpetuate imperialist impunity. President Spano actually says the courts are just the judges, and hence they're unbiased, and hence whatever happens about the prosecution or the enforcement doesn't really matter. To Professor Spano, I'd like to say, when Ovid said 2 millennia ago, gods have their own laws, he never said, the judges are unbiased, but gods have their own laws. As long as gods have their own laws, it doesn't matter if the judges are unbiased or not. And in the current status quo, countries, heads of states, warlords who consider themselves above God can get away with committing mass murder, genocide, human rights violations, expansionist wars, and other forms of aggression. What I want to convince you tonight is that these flaws are not a side effect of Trumpism or some wrecking ball response from the left. Or the right for that matter. What I want to convince you tonight is that these flaws are structural and they're foundational, and that no matter if you reduce these powers and equalize every state, they still perpetuate because of the very structure of the courts as they exist. I've read all 1,600 pages of the Travaux Préparatoires in preparation for this, the legal documentation, the diplomatic correspondences that went into making the Rome Statute, and hence the International Court, and International Criminal Court. And we look at the legal records, you notice that in the 1990s, there was a moment where we were all on the same page. There was optimism in the air. Clinton actually signed the document, but never ratified it. There was a moment where every country could have actually signed on to and accepted the International Criminal Court. What I want to ask you is, why did they not? What changed? There was a moment when the US realized that they could be held accountable, when an institution with actual teeth could be set up, and that would hold imperialists accountable for imperial crimes. And hence the US pulled out, and like dominoes, China left, Russia left, Israel left, and what of the rest of us? We were left to play by the rules that hegemons had long abandoned. But don't take my word for it. Ambassador Rapp is here in this room. He was actually in the room where it happened. He was one of the most optimistic supporters for the US joining the International Criminal Court. He was actually serving in one of the most optimistic and liberal times of contemporary American history under President Obama. And even then, with all the cards stacked in their favor, nothing happened. Why? Because it was never in America's best interest. But that did not suffice. It's not enough to kill the courts. The Western world had to dance on its grave. No one here has actually talked about the 2002 Hague Invasion Act, which the Americans passed, which actually empowers the American president to storm the ICC, to bomb it and invade it if they ever have the audacity to take an American to court. That is a system they want us to have confidence in? What no one else even mentions, it's not just the Americans, it's even the Russians. Medvedev, the former Russian president and prime minister, very recently said, everyone walks under God and missiles. Judges of the court, watch the skies carefully. Is this the system they want us to support, where it's very easy for large countries with impunity to simply make these statements and threaten the very hardworking lawyers that work in The Hague, in the frigid conditions of those courts too, I'm very sure. But what's important to notice here, my friends, is not only do you not have to enter the courts to not be part of them, you can just leave. In 2017, Burundi just left when the court tried to open a case against them. Duterte left in 2019 when the court hinted that they would investigate Philippines and its very vicious and aggressive war on drugs. This is the very structure of court, President Spano, that I criticize today. It's not the fact that you can't just take a case to the court. It's the fact that the court is so weak that people can just leave. Would you trust a legal system where the guilty can walk out and slam the door behind them and face no consequences? I personally would not. Thomas Frank famously said, the most surprising thing about international law is that nations ever obey it. And that's what we see today. It's not just the ICC. Let's look at the ICJ. We discussed Uganda. We discussed Myanmar. In all of these successful cases that the opposition actually brings to today, nothing ever happened because these verdicts were simply ignored. Israel has time and time again ignored any verdicts about the illegality of its wall, of its occupation, and of its settlements in Gaza. No, thank you. Dane, for example, very recently mentioned in his opening speech that there was this is a successful story, by the way. They mentioned that Nicaragua took the US to the court, and that's a successful story. But they're so desperate to win this debate, they don't tell you the entirety of the story. Let me complete the story for you. What do you think happened when Nicaragua took the US to the courts? Any guesses? Anyone? Let me tell you exactly what happened. Did the US cease operations? No, it did not. Did they pay the reparations the court asked them to pay the people of Nicaragua? No, that they did not. What did they do instead? They went to the UN Security Council to block any act of enforcement, and they simply withdrew from the ICJ case like nothing happened. That happened in 1986, and nothing has changed since. That is the world they paint for you today. A world where we give out these proclamations that, oh my God, Nicaragua took the US to court. But when you actually look at the effects of it, it has not affected the life of a single Nicaraguan citizen, for the better, at least. We have the former president of the European Court of Human Rights here. And they've given us successful stories. They said Azerbaijan and Romanis have often used the court for their benefit. But let me remind you of the names that they don't mention. The fact that the UK, Turkey, Azerbaijan itself have not actually followed through on the verdicts of this court. In 2010, for example, the ECHR passed the proclamation that Russia's ban on pride parades violated freedom of assembly. Anybody want to know what the verdict was? Finish my sentences. You guessed it. The verdict was ignored. And Russia, in fact, doubled down and extended the ban for 100 years. 100-year ban on pride parades in Russia. If that's not a sign of arrogance, a sign of impunity, and a sign of the kangaroo courts that no one takes seriously, I do not know what is. But let's be charitable to them. Let's take them at their best. I'm only going to use examples from now on that they have told you. And let's see where these examples take you, right? The name is taken by the opposition of Charles Taylor. Sure, Charles Taylor was held accountable. That didn't stop any future warlords from the same part of the world and did not scare them into not committing war crimes. Ambassador Rapsan Milosevic was held. Milosevic died before he ever saw one day in court. What was the point then if no justice was actually served? This is not justice. This is not any accountability. This is a travesty. But let me now tell you, ladies and gentlemen, of the names we do not hear from their side. They don't mention Bush or Blair. And let's be better. Let's be more charitable. Let's say the courts function exactly as opposition wants us to think they function. In that best case scenario, I want you to ask yourselves this. If the courts function fantastically, would you still ever see a situation where Bush or Blair would have to see an international court for their crimes of aggression in Iraq? You would not. Can you imagine a world where any American soldier, general, commander, decision maker, diplomat could ever be tried for the atrocities committed in Mazar al-Sharif, for the atrocities and torture in Abu Ghraib, for the detainment without charge and tortures in Guantanamo? Can you, even in your best case scenario, imagine Netanyahu or Putin behind bars? We're expected to have confidence in this pantomime, where we can't, in our best case scenario, even take their best examples and say they would actually follow through and enforce them. Let me come to my conclusion by saying I'm actually not against international courts, or international law, no matter how much I may stand on the side. But I will not pretend that this travesty represents international law at its best or even at its worst. Let me finally ask you, dear audience members, who's really watching this debate tonight? Who really cares about the outcome? I can promise you Trump, Netanyahu, Putin do not care. They already have thrown this law in the dustbin. The international lawyers are already being employed by these courts. They've already made up their minds. Let me tell you who really cares. The children of Gaza buried under the rubble of a war of aggression, the victims of Abu Ghraib and Mazar al-Sharif, the survivors of genocide in Myanmar, in Sudan, in Ethiopia. If you can, or members of the opposition, can look them in the eye with a straight face and tell them these systems will hold their butchers accountable, that these systems will take the butchers to court, and that these systems will ensure that reparations are paid for crimes committed against them, then sure, vote side opposition. But if you wish to be realistic, if you realize that these courts were never built for these individuals, and they never will be, if you realize that these courts are grand in name but hollow in function, if you realize that these are simply paper tigers, they're not fair, they're not effective, they have not deterred war criminals, and they never will, in that case, ladies and gentlemen, open your eyes, don't buy this legal bullshit, support side proposition. Thank you very much.